well, as I say, we got no control over the technology, have we?
No.
Sorry, I should say the internet speed.
All
right. Are we? Let's have a look. Are we live?
Yep.
And hey, folks, fill up the. So whoever was watching us ain't watching us anymore. Okay, so we won't bother repeating what we said earlier. I suppose we should just get in and talk about what we decided that we were going to talk about.
Yeah. Yes. No, like you say, and even technology. You love it, but you hate it, but you can't live without it.
Yeah. So, what did we decide that we were going to talk about?
I think just the continuation of the Stones and how they basically just got bigger, I guess, through ultimately traveling over to America for the first time and off the back of a very successful British tour. And the fact that they just really started to gel and become, started to write their own songs. And we talked about this before that and Charlie Watts and quite a few of them mentioned that, once America loves you, it's it. You're pretty much, you're good for a while.
I missed that, mate. There was a bit of our friend, the internet lag was there. What did you say about what did Charlie say?
Oh, Charlie mentioned about when America loves you, you're pretty much gold. And it took a while. The first tour was a short tour, but the second tour they got a lot of exposure, a lot of TV shows, and I was thinking about this the other day. They got some studio time in the famous Chess Studios, cut a whole album.
So who organised that? Was that Andrew Loog Oldham? Was he instrumental behind doing that?
I could imagine behind the scenes he would have been very instrumental, yes, because he would have obviously talked to the Chess brothers, and it would have been the Chess brothers being businessmen. The Rolling Stones running hot. Let's give these young boys some studio time and let's promote Chess Records. So it was a win-win for everyone. And yeah, it showed you that from obviously the first album was recorded in England on a budget, still had a very raw sound, but it showed you the American studios and just how much more, not necessarily refined, but how bigger and more elaborate they were.
Was that the first time, do you think, Marshall met the Stones?
He would have been probably a teenager back then. He would have probably been maybe 13, 14, who knows? Because definitely his father and his uncle were the brothers that created Chess Records. Marshall probably got wind of some of the stories a bit later on, like the painting of the ceiling. But along with obviously the Chess Studios, they cut some tracks at RCA Studios and Hollywood Studios as well. RCA, I think, in New York, and Hollywood Studios, obviously in Hollywood. Yeah.
So how important do you think that was in the development of the Stones as a musical group, recording in those American studios?
Oh, would have been eye-opening. Just the access to the different gear, different producers hanging around. They probably would have got to see other bands play in the studio, get some ideas. Probably learned a bit about overdubbing. And actually, I want to talk about this before I forget. I think that the Vox amp must have had a tremolo, because when Brian Jones did Mona, I Need You Baby, that whole sound is a tremolo, isn't it?
Well, yes, yeah. But jeepers, some of that stuff could have been added,
Could have been
you know, afterwards too. So, you know, what do they call it? In the mixing.
yes, of course.
Did they have that technology back then?
Well, they definitely had the power to overdub. Don't know about different sounds, but I want to research that because I'm fascinated by those early amps. Really am. But yeah, you've got the books. I've got the books there. The American tours were really instrumental in them developing as a band. I mean, all of a sudden the arenas were bigger. All of a sudden they were sharing the bill, not with during the Pacemakers and not with, some Liverpool band or some band from Manchester, but sharing the bill with the guys like, the Beach Boys and James Brown and Marvin Gaye. And wow, they would have just been like, we've made it.
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by the Stones and their American recordings, just like I was fascinated with Cream when, Cream flew over and recorded their, well, not first album,
second one.
Second album. I was always fascinated by that because clearly they were around probably the best recording techniques and the best studios in the world.
Absolutely.
You had the same thing with Fleetwood Mac. They were recording in America the same time.
Yep.
68, 69. So, yeah, fascinating. And then, our comparative band that we were going to use throughout the series, the Beatles never recorded anything in America.
I did not know that. I learned something. Wow.
Well, none of those albums, as far as I know.
So George Martin was very much not necessarily a purist, but he probably would have been. He was very much in the Abbey Road Studios. That was his domain.
Yeah, I just want to have a quick shout out, mate, before I answer that. David Ennis says a nice thing. He says, "I always look forward to Carl and Andrew." So,
Cool.
cheers, David. We appreciate that. I'm going to add my 2 cents here. I don't think the Beatles recording regime was necessarily dictated by George Martin.
Okay.
But I think if George Martin had pushed the issue for the Beatles to go to America to record, certainly, who knows? But yeah, I think that's probably a bit of a sideline thing for me to research. Certainly, why didn't the Beatles record in America? Maybe the Beatles themselves just wanted to stay in London.
Well, it might have been a time. Obviously, they were touring a lot, and obviously touring America a lot. The studio might have been a time where they could reflect and get away from all that stuff. They probably felt at home in an English studio, because I have heard as Billy Wyman mentioned that he'd love to get back to England for a proper cup of tea. So so those guys, New York, the big lights, like Jimmy Reed said, bright lights, big city. But a lot of those guys love to get back home. They missed marmalade. They missed their cups of tea. They missed, I guess, the English country air, bangers and mash, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and that 2010 documentary where they're celebrating Exile on Main Street, and they're interviewing Bill, and Bill said, he said, I hated it. He said, you couldn't just go down to the shops and buy milk and eggs and your tea or your piccalilli like you could in London, because they didn't have that. And I was an Englishman and I wanted my piccalilli and my PG tips.
Well, I can understand that, because I've turned into a tea nut. I've grown up, I love cups of tea. In America, is such a caffeinated coffee culture, and I'd occasionally have cups of tea, but it was never the same. And then I was in San Francisco and I asked for a scone, and they said, "You mean a scone?" And this thing was hard as a brick. And I'm like, that was the first and last time I bought a scone. in America. Just, wasn't the same.
Okay, so JC Smith has said something. He said that the early Vox AC15 amps had vibrato via a toggle switch.
Ah, yeah. I think it's an accessory. Is it an accessory to the amp, or is it on the amp?
Well, you see, I've got the Beatles Stones book, but I haven't done any research on that AC15 amp. So I'm sorry. And I also have I've got the Beatles book too. But I don't know. I don't know. The reissue that I had a couple of years ago had reverb and the tremolo.
Tremolo and vibrato, that's the same thing, isn't it? Different words?
Good question.
I think it's
good question. Shall I? Well, you keep talking while I see if I can answer it.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating what how you're raised, and you just get accustomed to certain things, and you go to another country and everything's new. You can't replace those country roots.
Well, I think you're right, and we said this before earlier, and I think we'll keep coming back to it as our shows progress. The Beatles had Vox amps for a long, long time, and they're good. Don't get me wrong, but when the Stones hit America and jumped on those Fender amps, it was just a different path.
Mm. And I could see with that Fender amp, possibly not necessarily a bigger sound, but obviously getting a bit more rocky too.
Were there any scandals on that first American tour?
Man, it's been a while since I've read up about it. I think they got harassed a lot with their hair, and I think some of the cops harassed them in the southern states. But they were pretty innocent in those days. There wasn't really anything going on as far as drugs. You see a lot of pictures of them drinking Coke, having glass bottles of Coke. They were relatively still pretty innocent. They did mention, I think they bumped into Johnny Cash or somebody. They were talking to somebody on the road, and they said, "How do you do it?" And I think they flirted a little bit with amphetamines to keep up.
Oh, I think everybody was doing amphetamines. The Beatles were certainly, as we know, in Hamburg. But I think that American tour, was that the one where Dean Martin had a go at them and berated them and made them feel uncomfortable in his presentation?
Well, there's a few things. Dean Martin was, as we know, part of the Brat Pack, and their prime was mid-50s to the early 60s. So, they had Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., there's another guy, about four of them, and they were pretty much the royalty in places like Las Vegas and some of the circles of Los Angeles, and they would have considered the Beatles and the Stones a threat because they knew that these guys were getting a bit older, and they were good at what they did. They were cabaret, lounge music, jazz. They touched on a lot of different, but I think Dean would have been a little bit probably, I would think, a bit not weary, but almost envious of the band because he knew his time was up. And as we know it, the Stones, the Beatles, the counterculture, the rock culture, just exploded. Those baby boomers from post-World War II became the new voice. Dean and those guys were on the outs then.
Yeah, I'll take it one step further. Certainly they saw these guys as a threat, but I think that's a perfect representation of what the old guard was, what popular music was, and what popular music was going to be, and the power of young people, and what the Stones represented, that edgy street type energy
Angst.
that Dean Martin and the Rat Pack craved.
Because let's face it, and I'm not going to put Elvis in there, but Elvis was kind of told what to do. Those guys basically sung a lot of soundtracks. They had songwriters. There was the Tin Pan Alley team. The Tin Pan Alley was a group of songwriters from New York, and they sung a lot of standards. They were pretty predictable. They were good. Like Dean Martin was a clever guy. He was a good actor. He was a comedian. He was a one of the most famous drunks of all time. He was very dry. But their time was up. That's it. You know, they had a good run.
Absolutely. And they got knocked off their perch.
Absolutely. Make way for the younger guys. They got something to say. You know, and all power to these younger guys. They were writing songs. They were questioning the authority. They were saying, listen, you know what? What's going on with the segregated radio? Let's put Muddy Waters on the top of the bill. Let's get Buddy Guy out of the South. Let's give these guys their dues. Let's give Chuck Berry top billing. You know,
what did the average American teenager think the Rolling Stones were when they heard them on the radio before they saw them in publicity photos or on TV? Would they have thought that they were black?
I would say no, but they would have thought that they were different. Definitely different to white bands in America. They would have definitely had the simple fact that, well, but basically we know that they, as young guys, they played the blues really well. I mean, I think some people thought Elvis was black through the radio because there was less of a visual culture back then. But I think, and in credit to the Beatles, I think the Stones got caught up in that Beatlemania. You know, the young girls and the frenzy. I think after a while, it took maybe 2 or 3 tours for the Stones to really be considered, you know, well, especially get your A's out, but a bona fide rock band, you know?
Oh, yeah, and people had grown up. It's amazing what a 14-year-old does and thinks, and then 3 years later, you know, 14, got to count fingers here, 15, 16, 17, you know, 7, you know, there's a big difference in your perception and your worldly outlook from a 14 to a 17 to an 18-year-old. And you know, as we've said before, you know, the Stones clearly put themselves in the forefront of what was happening socially in America in '68. You know, you had the famous Democrat convention, you had student riots in France, and
Yep.
the Stones were all part of that. You know, young people were questioning everything that was taken for granted for the last 50 years.
Absolutely. You had the Vietnam War.
Yeah, of course. Sorry. Yeah, the Vietnam War, which, you know, I could never, I could never appreciate or understand because, you know, it's miles away from our experience, isn't it?
Well, I mean, sympathy for the devil. I mean, something about shooting the Kennedys, you know, so it was a very interesting 3 or 4 years. You know, the Stones basically had to grow up pretty quick. Had to grow up.
I just want to do a shout out, mate. We've got Dan Sullivan here and another good friend of ours, R2R3 Locking Nut. You might remember him, Carl. He's from Chicago.
Wow.
So, yeah. So he's
2120 South Michigan Avenue.
That's your job, Locking Nut, to go there. Take a photo for us. Is that still there with all the redevelopment going on?
I think it's gone. Actually, there's a famous album, and I've got it, and you would have heard it. It's called The Biggest Thing Since Colossus.
Oh, yeah, I've got it.
So that's an interesting story behind that. Obviously, we know that one of our other loves, Fleetwood Mac, got some Chess studio time.
That's Otis Spann.
With Otis Spann, yeah. But
Yeah.
they managed to sneak in before that original studio either relocated or got shut down, one or the other. But that was the last album recorded there.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was 1970, I think, or late 69, maybe November. Yeah. All happened around the same time, eh? It's just amazing that we talk about those 3 famous years. And the other thing you got to realize too, just not to get off topic, is with changing in the 60s, when we saw the famous shot of the Rolling Stones doing Satisfaction on the Ed Sullivan Show, it was on colour TV.
Yeah.
With the Firebirds, they brought out the Firebirds all of a sudden. And they just looked cool. You could tell that they'd gone to some of these New York fashion shops. And so that was another thing, that all of a sudden colour was coming into life. The TV went from black and white, Beatlemania, black and white suits. Everything was very conservative. And all of a sudden, overnight, everything got colourful, liberal, and slightly psychedelic.
So why do you think they bought the Firebirds? Was there any reason? Were they inspired by anybody in particular, or would it have just been the shape?
Good question. I've always loved the look. I've never owned one. Brian played one quite often. We saw him at the Royal Albert Hall with that famous clip there. I imagine they're pretty heavy guitars, like a Les Paul.
I've played an Epiphone version of one a couple of years ago. And it was heavy. It was a heavy guitar. So,
yeah.
but I would expect the Gibson version to probably be heavier.
And they didn't have the designated humbuckers. They had the small humbuckers, didn't they?
You see, I don't know.
Yeah. But you can see just by how the Stones started to change. The hair got longer. Keith started to grow sideburns. They started they started to get a lot more confidence, I think, in the way they looked, having all this access to these different studios. Probably, I mean, Bob Dylan came into the mix about 66 and influenced their songwriting. And these tours were great. It's a bit like with my work, with open homes. It's all about meeting people. So they would have met a lot of people, especially in the big cities.
Well, I've spoken to a few people over the years who have been to, some of these concerts. And there's one lady that's a member of our Facebook group. Kathy is her name, and she's got a couple of famous photographs that she took of the Stones at Madison Square Gardens, and she hung it with the faces. I'll send you a link to her page after the show. Anyway, I've spoken to her a couple of times, and she said to me that one of the important things about going to concerts back then is that they were like a social event. People went a couple of hours or 3 hours beforehand, and they were hanging out and talking, and youth politics was an issue, and current events were discussed. Then they would go and watch the show.
Yep.
Bit different now. People what do they talk about now before they go to shows?
I don't even bother. I mean, they all hang their cell phone up in the air, and I don't know. It's a couple of DJs with spinning some records and some fireworks and some techno music in the background, and I don't know. I don't understand it. I can't. I can't either. So yeah, I can't. I was talking to the Stones a while back in the 60s, and they said there was no such thing as American Idol back then either. It was just bands playing. That was it.
Well, that's the thing today, I mentioned this last night to a group of friends. We were talking about Van Halen, and, I said, I remember when Van Halen were a popular band. Yeah. When Jump came out and Panama came out, they were two popular songs.
Yep.
that were on, you know, top 40, top 20, top 10 radio. They were a band. You
Yep.
look now, what are the bands now?
Well, I mean, we can just talk about the American Music Awards. Up to about maybe 2006, you'd have like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, you'd have maybe Prince, you'd have Carlos Santana, and then last 8 years, 6 years, it's just got worse and worse and worse. It's sad. I mean, it's almost like these record companies are just controlling us to the point where they want to control what you listen to.
I've given your comment in an earlier show some considerable thought, and I think it's I haven't heard it before, and so I'm going to give you the credit for drawing my attention to it. You had the 1950s that was controlled by the record companies.
Yep.
You know, they were molding artists. You had Fabian, you had guys like that were molded by a record company, told how to look, and
Yes.
given songs. And then you had, you know, a reaction to that, represented by the Stones and the Beatles, where performers were writing their own songs. So
Absolutely.
today we've got that similar situation. People get picked because of what they look like, and then they're given songs, and they don't even need to necessarily sound good. They don't play any instruments, and they go out there and sell 1 million records. Well, 1 million downloads.
And as soon as they start to become a bit independent or go off the script, you'd be amazed that all of a sudden they are unheard of it now. They got forgotten about, because it's more cost effective for these people to be part of a machine. And I want to talk about something else that we were when we talked about Beatlemania in England and how it affected the whole world, and I was talking to these I think held the record, the biggest television viewership in the whole world was when the Beatles first got to America, and the whole country was transfixed. I was talking to all these black women from church, and they said one of their earliest childhood memories was watching the Beatles on one of those talk shows, Ed Sullivan Show or something. I think they had, it was bigger than the Super Bowl. It was bigger than politics. It was, I mean, I think 2/3 or 3/4 of the country was tuned in to watch the Beatles on the show. It was like
73 million Americans.
Is that the number? Is it?
Well, that I've read.
Yeah. Wow. Huge. And then this is the early start, I think, or an extension of that fabrication of the 50s. Remember the Monkees?
Yes.
As far as I'm concerned, that was a pathetic attempt to piggyback off Beatlemania from the American point of view, because they had the Davy Jones, the good-looking kid with the British accent, and you know, they weren't bad musicians. I like songs like Stepping Stone and that, but they were manufactured. You know, they were told what to do, and they had a little TV show, and it's almost like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but the human version.
and they send Jimi Hendrix on tour with them.
Talk about chalk and cheese.
I don't think that tour finished. I think did Jimmy split? Did the Jimi Hendrix Experience split? But they didn't finish the tour, I don't think.
Well, and we're touching on some good subjects, because I think that's why Jimmy felt really at home in England, because he loved Noel Redding, he loved Mitch Mitchell, he loved the Stones, he loved the Beatles. He knew that these guys were independent and creative and were real, because Jimmy was a very deep thinker. He was very conscious.
And they loved Jimmy.
Absolutely.
You know, they loved Jimmy. They appreciated. I just finished watching again a couple of days ago Eric Clapton's Life in 12 Bars, and there's a section there that I hadn't seen before. And anyway, Eric's been interviewed by an American reporter.
Yep.
And Eric's talking to the American reporter about what's happening in England, saying, "Hey, there's this cat called Jimi Hendrix, who, by the way, he's an American, and he's turning heads and blowing people away in England. So, yeah, that's amazing." I'm going, wow, this is Clapton to an American reporter. Yeah.
I know. It was a shame. It was a tragedy. That show, I don't know what was happening, but Hendrix, as good as he was, couldn't get a break in America, had to go to England. And as soon as the English people basically adopted him and American got a hold of him again, his coming home show was the Monterey Festival. That was his, like, welcome back, this is who I am, and I'm going to blow the roof off, which he did. And he lit a guitar up as well, I think.
Yeah. And well, that's the theme though of our show, isn't it? It's a celebration of the Stones and that whole British blues movement that Jimi Hendrix was a key component of, and an inspirer of.
And to credit to, I mean, obviously Jimmy is a master and one of the greatest, if not the greatest, rock guitar player of all time. But a credit to the Beatles and the Stones and the love that they had for not only Jimmy and the blues, but to actually, I mean, let's face it, it was the bass player Chaz Chandler from the Animals that basically said, "What are you guys doing? Why is he not big? I'm going to take him under my wing." So, credit to those British guys for believing in some of these Americans.
I just want to ask you too, what's your view of that Hendrix film that came out, the biopic that came out a couple of years ago with, is it Andre 3000 acting as Jimmy? What's your opinion on that film?
Yeah, I've only seen the trailer. Apparently because of publishing rights, or they couldn't do his songs or something, is that right?
Mate, you need to see it. It's I like the film. I rate the film. Andre 3000 did a very, very good job of portraying Jimi Hendrix. It's a tragedy they couldn't use his songs. It's a tragedy. It would have been a blockbuster had they. But there's that good scene in there where Keith Richards' girlfriend pinches a Strat, but it doesn't portray one of our heroes very well. It portrays Keith Richards as a bit of a crybaby.
Yeah. Well, actually, and here's the Stones connection too. And there's that famous picture of Brian laced out in that Moroccan clothes, sniffing his fingers, and Jimmy's they're both holding big Budweiser cans at Monterey, and apparently on a few things. But Brian Jones was the one that introduced him to America. He's one that he was the MC for that occasion, wasn't he?
Yeah, R2R3 is saying, I think I saw that where Andre 3000 plays Jimmy. Yeah, that's right. Like I was saying before, R2R3, I thought Andre did a pretty good job. It caused a few upsets with a few people because Jimmy, there was some domestic violence scenes in there where Jimmy apparently assaulted one of his girlfriends a few times.
Yeah.
Some people didn't like that being included. I'm not going to make a judgment on that. The only judgment I will make about the film, it's sad that they couldn't use his actual music.
Yeah, this sounds a bit petty. Why not use his music and give a portion back to the to his family trust or whatever it is?
So what about a Stones film? What that'll have to be like 6 hours long, that film.
Yeah, I've seen that Brian Jones film. Ain't bad. You seen that one?
Yeah, it's not bad.
It's okay. Yeah, I was thinking about this before, and I did that screenshot of Confessing the Blues, was it? Or I Can't Be Satisfied, when the Stones are playing really well and quite bluesy, and Brian playing that masterful slide. What a shame there wasn't a whole lot of good early live performances of them. Everything's very spotty. Obviously, we've got the Ready Steady Go to thank for some of the recordings, but a lot of that was overdubbed. And just a shame that we didn't get to see some of this stuff, live on TV. But yeah, we got the record still.
Yeah. Well, that's correct, and I think probably another good thing too about social media, if you're a band, is that even if you're only going to be on the scene for 5 minutes, there's going to be a lot of footage of you out there performing. So that's always a good thing.
Yeah. They did a good job with the Beatles, though. There was a lot of footage of the Beatles, live shows and concerts and interviews, and they really were quite well managed.
Yeah, I've got the Live at the Budokan DVD, and most people celebrate that because in Japan at the time there wasn't a lot of screaming and yelling and carrying on, because they were just sitting there and they would clap gently.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of interesting scenes in there where they're singing, must be Nowhere Man or something, and they're singing the high notes, and George is seen waving the crowd so that the crowd would clap so that they could hide them not being able to hit the high notes.
Yeah.
But I read about 6 months ago that they were redoing that. They were remastering that DVD. So when that does happen, that's going to be interesting. And there was that Ron Howard film that came out a couple of years ago, The Touring Years. Again,
how was that?
Good. It was good. Nothing new. It was everything that we, knew. I suppose if you were new to the Beatles, and for young people, which clearly it's marketed towards, I'm happy if a lot of young people walked away thinking, "Wow, the Beatles, man, cool." If people have done that, well, that film certainly has done the job.
Good.
But
just want to give Japan a bit of credit. Every band that goes to Japan, or every band that records there, the sound is amazing. The Japanese are really good. The bands love to tour Japan. I mean, you've got Roy Buchanan live in Japan. You've got Otis Rush live in Japan. Albert Collins live in Japan. They record all their albums over there. So
Clapton loved touring Japan. Famous double album that came out in 1980. Was it Just One Night or something? You're right. There's something about Japan for rock and roll, guys. It's amazing.
So obviously a very quiet crowd, but a very respectful listening crowd.
Do you think also the technology, because a lot of electronic development and technology was developing out of Japan at that time, so that surely must have had some significance.
Well, I was talking to my dad about it, and he brought up a really good point. Because of communism in China and obviously the sadness of the Hiroshima and the World Wars, the young Japanese kids who, by the way, to this day love blues and jazz and pay big money for jazz records, almost felt like they were deprived of their youth. So they felt like they had to play catch up. So they would just flock to concerts because they had no fun in their youth. So here's these
really
that gave us all this excitement. And they were like the biggest fans of all.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a fact. So it just goes to show you as well, as we talk about the Stones in America and England and touring those places. When they toured some of these other countries, the lights went on. It's like, not only what is this, but like we can have fun. We some of those countries would have been pretty dark and conservative, or, there's a iron veil,
Have you read what Keith Richards says about New Zealand when he toured here with the Stones?
Is that in '64 or was this
64? Yeah.
Invercargill, of course, yeah.
Dunedin. He's oh my gosh, he doesn't say nice things about New Zealand.
Well, can you imagine in 1964, bitterly cold sou'westers, Dunedin, Invercargill, everything's shut by 5. There's no such thing as motel. You're in a motel, but there's no room service. Food's probably really bland.
That's right. And there was a knock on the door Sunday morning for church.
So they were like, wow, get me out of here. Because they loved, you saw so many pictures of them in Florida. They loved the sun and the martinis and obviously the girls and, because Britain would have been obviously quite cold. So they would have loved the sun.
Just shows how poles apart New Zealand and Britain were, because, obviously we had similarities back then because we were a British colony to England. I suppose, if you came from a small town in a small town in England to any place in New Zealand, well, there wouldn't have been much difference.
Probably they probably would have felt like, Invercargill or Dunedin would have probably felt like to them a very small town in England that they were probably trying to get away from.
Yeah, and certainly if you're in London though, you would notice the difference. But and then you get the Stones, and there they are, these skinny little white guys hanging out. There's photographs of them by the pool, drinking their cokes, just loving it.
Absolutely. I when I was a kid growing up, I was so enamored with the Stones, not because of just the Stones and the music, but the journey that they went on. I kind of lived my life. I was trying to live. My imagination was part of their journey. Was the American tours and just the concerts and the shows. It was real cool. They would have lived. They've lived a good life.
Yeah.
They did things in a small amount of time that would take us a lifetime.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Hey, so we've been on air for a while, and we had a bit of a technical issue with an internet connection.
Yep.
And I need to shoot off and do something else. So if we can have a bit of a wrap up, what do you want to talk about on Wednesday? Is there anything particular that you should prepare me for? 43 minutes.
I think we talked about this before. Maybe we could talk a little bit about Bob Dylan. I think he's a heavyweight, and how the Stones became songwriters. Obviously, we've talked about the tours. We talked about their gear. Maybe we could talk about some of their songs they wrote. Part of their journey. Obviously, blues lovers. They were, live shows, concerts. Getting their chops up with a couple of albums under their belt. But all of a sudden, meeting Bob Dylan and becoming serious songwriters.
I agree with you. And being a Beatles nut, we all know how important and influential Bob Dylan was to John Lennon in particular. He wrote, is it Hide Your Love Away and Norwegian Wood, because he was inspired by Bob Dylan. And there's a famous scene where Bob Dylan and him traveling in a London taxi in the morning, I think, after being out the night before. And they're giving each other a bit of grief, sitting there with their dark sunglasses on.
Yeah, well, Bob Dylan was the epitome of cool, because he he basically answered to nobody. He was his own man, and he was he'd been living that kind of not necessarily outlaw, but that touring, vagabond kind of life since the age of 18, 19 on the streets. There's a couple of quotes I'd like to mention. Bob Dylan said, he goes, "I could have written Satisfaction, but you could have never written Tambourine Man." I think that's the quote. Yeah, and there's another quote. I think the press did this or something. The Beatles wanted to hold your hand, but the Rolling Stones wanted to spend the night together.
There's another famous segment. I think they're talking about Sticky Fingers, and they're interviewing this famous English journalist, Shah somebody, and I have to be careful how I say this because this is on YouTube. And he said, "Look, the Beatles were just were the band that got it." The Rolling Stones was the band that came along that finished the job. So I always I'm a simple guy, and when people put things like this in phrases and terms that I can understand, I get it, man.
Yeah. Oh no, you're right. Because let's face it, and wrapping it up, part of the Beatlemania and the Stones frenzy was they were basically not told to write pop songs, but their bread and butter would have been pop songs. But once they got established and a lot more confident, then they could they did indeed write proper songs. Paint it black, for one.
Well, here's a topic here. So JC Smith's asking, how does an ugly, skinny kid like Jagger get chicks?
I've heard girls say two things. Some girls say he's so ugly that he's attractive. Others say he's just, other ladies have said they think he's just wonderful. But I was talking to that guy that I was telling you about, Barry Hancock, who's I'm selling his houses, and he's the lead singer in that band. He said, especially the lead singer, it's all to do with confidence and showmanship, And that's what Mick Jagger had. And that's, as we know, unfortunately drove the rift with Brian, was that people started to distinguish him as the lead man, their front man.
Well, I've read a few music biographies over the years, and I think what it comes down to is that when people become famous, there's this power about them that ordinary people gravitate to and just want to be part of. It's
presence. Yeah.
And guys like Mick Jagger had the intellect, obviously, the artistic drive to pull it off, and jeepers, he's still pulling it off. Didn't he father another kid to some 23-year-old or 24-year-old a couple of years ago?
Yeah. And he said that whatever it takes, he'll make sure that he will financially support the new baby.
Well, a couple of million there, it's no problem to make. He's what, $300 million or something?
Sir Mick Jagger, yeah. I mean, unbelievable. Yeah, but you're right. I mean, Mick Jagger. I mean,
well, here's another question too, and this is certainly one that we were going to talk about, Dan, later on. Dan's saying, how is Keith Richards still alive? He seems still high on heroin from the 70s in every video I've seen recently. But we certainly will talk about Keith Richards. That will be one show, maybe two shows, as an individual, and what he did, and how he came out from the end of that spiral. It amazes me still. How old is the guy? 74.
Unbelievable. Yeah, he's just a very strong constitution.
Yeah. So I look forward to that show because Keith is Superman.
I would love to know when he actually properly got into heroin. I'm thinking it's 68, but I don't know. But that's another subject altogether. but definitely through the 70s was definitely hardcore on the jug, and we can talk about that later.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I look forward to. Yeah, and Dan's saying the same thing too. I love Keith though. Yeah, we do. We certainly do. Because we're guitar players, some of those riffs that he's done over the years, my gosh, Jumping Jack Flash, Can't You Hear Me Knocking? It's endless, isn't it? Endless.
I mean, most bands, I would consider myself fortunate to come up with one lick or one riff and call it a day and say I've made it.
Oh, I've got a riff. I've got a go-to riff that I do every time I pick up my guitar, man. Hasn't made me $1 million.
He would have at least 25 instantly recognizable heavyweight riffs that are just attached to him. I mean, we can name 10 off the bat, but there's 15.
And that's a show. That's a show.
Yeah.
That's a show. That's next Saturday's show.
What his lesser known riffs or his riffs together?
25 heavyweight, the top 25 Keith Richards riffs.
Okay. All right. Okay, but what's the rules? Is it open G tuning or what?
A whole lot. Yeah, I like lists because everyone else compiles lists, and I never agree with anyone else's lists. So my lists are always good.
Here's another show, and I've actually had a lot of fun on Spotify. Is the Stones recorded such great albums that we all know 2 or 3 songs off the album. What about all their lesser known songs that are just heavyweights? Memory Motel. I mean, amazing.
I think most Stones nuts will know. I think our program's geared to Stones nuts, I suppose, and if anyone that comes across and watches our show that doesn't consider themselves a Stones nut, and we turn them on to a couple of tunes from some of their famous albums, that's great. But I would say most of the guys that we hang out with would know all the songs, wouldn't they?
I mean, if you're a true fan, and I've been guilty of this, where you just listen to the hits. If you're a true fan, you play the album.
Yeah. Oh, but there's a couple of albums that I skip. Sorry, there's a couple of songs on albums that I skip.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's the great thing about music. I don't like that song.
Yeah.
I'm not going to listen to it.
Getting back to the Beatles, and you helped me with getting back to the Beatles, and my uncle as well is there's amazing nuggets on their albums that that Blue and Red album they did of the compilation 63 to 66 and then 66 to 71 that remember that album?
Yeah.
I mean cut a long story short, great songs, but that's just a little bit of icing on the cake. That's not the whole cake. That's just the pop.
And there's some rubbish too, like Obladi.
Yeah.
Oblad. There's some bad songs, man.
Yeah. I actually don't own those albums at all. I mean, you're a proper fan. Getting back to the Beatles and Stones, you actually own. And we used to have running jokes and most people are guilty of this when they start out. They buy compilations, but once you become a true fan, you actually kick the compilation to the curb and you actually buy the whole album because the album's a concept. It's a concept album based on that particular time period.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you and I spoke about this on an earlier show. We were of a generation where an album was an event. You bought the album and you took it home and you listened to it, or you went to someone else's house and you listened to the album. That's what you did.
Absolutely. A compilation, as convenient as they are, is just a hash up and a chop up of stuff over a period of time that's is done under the direction and supervision of a record company to make money.
That's right. It's all about the moolah.
I think Bob Dylan, back to Bob Dylan, when he fell off that motorcycle accident, he was disgusted they came out with that Bob Dylan Greatest Hits. He had no authority or supervision at all, apparently, that famous album.
Yeah.
So yeah,
it's a good album.
It's not bad. It came with a poster and everything, but just goes to show you, that we're getting back to inner turmoil within the band, but the band's having turmoil with the record companies.
You're selling your soul, brother, to the record companies. You know, that's the reality. You know, even the Stones. You know, the Stones got shafted by
Alan Klein.
You know, and he still today owns all those rights.
From 64 to 71, he owns all those songs, doesn't he?
That's right.
Abco. He did the same thing.
Yep.
Same thing to Sam Cooke, a filthy, filthy person.
Yep. Yeah. You know, so and I think that's the lesson for a lot of guys. I was watching Ben Coombs' show the other day, and he had his dad on, and it was a show that was going on for 4 hours. And his dad said, because he was a pretty good musician and played with a few established stars over the years, and he said that when people came and asked him for advice, he said to them, make sure you've got a good manager. Wow. Make sure that's the first thing, because I've seen a lot of guys come through this town get ripped off and taken to the cleaners by bad managers. So that's your responsibility as an artist.
Wow. Yeah, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. And the Beatles had the same problem with Alan Klein as well, didn't they?
Okay, so so JC Smith saying Fender Guru has to play each riff on the list live on air. Yeah, right. yeah, man. I'll give it a crack, though. I'm always keen to give it a crack, brother.
I'll tell you what, if you have 25 riffs and I have 25 riffs, that's going to be at least 2 shows.
Mate, we won't get past 5. We won't get past 5.
If the show is an hour, then you mean to tell me we've only got 2.5 minutes to talk about one riff?
No, I think we'll have to clear next week's schedule and go for 2 hours. I'll make sure I've got 2 hours up my sleeve. I think we'll have to do that, because once we get talking on that subject, man, one hour's not enough.
Yeah. I mean, look at Sticky Fingers. I mean, everyone talks about obviously Brown Sugar and Can't You Hear Me Knocking, but there's some other great riffs on there that don't get the mention, you know?
Yeah, what I think we should do is you need to record your list, and I'll record my list, and we'll go back and we'll revisit the list in another 3 months. And because you know how your music changes, even you know, listening to the stuff that we've been listening to for 30 years, you think, oh yeah, why didn't I put this on that list? So yeah, it'll be a fluid list. Yep. What do you reckon?
Sounds like a plan.
Awesome. So I'm just going to do a shout out before we knock off, if that's okay.
Yep.
JC Smith is saying yes, so he's going to pop on to next week's show, R2R3 Locking Up 2-hour power show. Dan Sullivan, appreciate all the nice, kind, and supportive comments, guys. You know, Carl and I, like we've said before, we're just 2 guys on the arse end of the world, stones nuts, and we just want to take some time out of our week and talk about something that's really important to us. Yeah,
absolutely. And you, I learned something today, and you've learned something, and it's actually funny because you actually start talking about something and the light bulb goes off and you actually remember something and you add it to the conversation, and just all that's how it is. I mean, nothing like being live, and you know, yeah.
Awesome.
It's how it should happen, live.
All right. So do you want to sign off, mate?
So Wednesday we'll have a midweek show, and then the big show next Sunday. Is that right?
Awesome.
Sounds good.
All right. So thanks to everyone in the chat.
Yep.